Hello, everybody. Panzer Penguin here once again, coming to you with a Global War 1936 to 1945 video. Today, I am joined once again by Rekoom, who has made it out of the woods safely and is back up and running.
Hooray!
And we're going to be talking mostly about the Spanish Civil War in this game, but the general topic being proxy wars, which is something I think we have alluded to in some of our previous videos in regards to new things that you don't see in Axis and Allies. Um, and the first two we'll talk about are going to be pretty short. Like I said, our main focus today is going to be the Spanish Civil War. So first up is uh, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. It's a war or a invasion that basically starts before the game does, so it doesn't count as an Italian attack on a neutral. The French player in this case controls the Abyssinians, and typically this, uh, or typically I think every time the Italians have more than enough units to finish off Abyssinia on the very first go. So it's not really much of a war. It's just more of a historical date and invasion than anything, in my opinion. Doesn't really affect gameplay, though I guess if the Italians have some really poor rolls, they could lose a couple of units that would otherwise be involved in the African theater. And that is the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in a nutshell. Uh, Moving on, we also have the Chinese Civil War, which, unlike the Spanish Civil War, doesn't really seem to be much of a civil war due to the threat of Japan coming in and the real lack of any sort of attacking units for the Chinese. The nationalists, for instance, if they ever roll a 12 for a unit, that unit is forced to retreat from battle. So not only can you take losses in a battle, but the half of your remaining forces may have to retreat at the end of each round. Um, so I think it's kind of hard for them to attack. China or communist China is sort of in the same place. They don't really have the income or the ability to build any sort of attacking units. I guess if the Russians really wanted to lend lease aircraft down to China, that could perhaps change things. But I don't think they're really in a position to do that either. So really, not much of a civil war between the Chinese factions here, um, unless I guess Japan chooses to ignore them completely, and then you may be able to expand and try and become a unified country. But from what I've seen so far, and I think Rekoom, you would agree with me that that seems pretty unlikely in most cases.
Yeah, Japan's always wanting to capture the Chinese territories. It's just so rich and they're so poorly defended. If for whatever reason Japan never goes in there, then yeah, eventually the two Chinese players want to fight each other, but that just seems like a rare occurrence.
Yeah, and obviously neither of us have really played this game enough to have seen uh, situations where that may occur. Though I do know there's a strategy floating out there where the Japanese do ignore China, so they avoid a potential situation where they might get bogged down due to the terrain and the lend lease that can be sent to China by all the allied countries at least once that kicks off. So let's get to the bread and butter of today's video, which is the Spanish Civil War over here in Spain. I know you have some experience playing the Republican side, and I have a few turns under my belt playing the nationalist side. But before we get into it, let me just explain to our viewers what it is real quick. So just like the other proxy wars going on at this time, this war is ongoing, and you start the game as at war. The German player controls the nationalists or the yellow troops in this case, while the Russian player controls the sort of plum purple colored troops. Clearly, the start seems to favor the Republicans based on territory count, the fact that they control Madrid, which is a city with its defensive bonuses. Um, However, the Germans can send aid to the nationalists, but so can the Italians. So the nationalist side has basically a 2-to-1 advantage in units each turn that are at least being sent to the conflict to help out. Um, if you look on page 60 in the rulebook, you can find all the nitty gritty details on the Spanish Civil War, how everything is conducted. Obviously, we're going to be going over all of that ourselves here, but always good to read up on the Spanish Civil War. And keep in mind, this is the Spanish Civil War uh, based on the vanilla version of the game. There is an expansion that we are looking into to some degree called the Spanish Civil War, which, from what I have read, makes this conflict uh, even more of a global thing where pretty much all the major powers can weigh in and all sorts of crazy stuff can happen. But if we do get to that expansion, there will be a completely separate video on that expansion. This one, like I said, will just be for the vanilla version of the game. Rekoom, uh, your thoughts? What I mean, you've played it a couple times. You've been Russia twice now. Not that we have gone through a complete game, but what are your thoughts on the Spanish Civil War and how it sort of affects uh, this game?
So I like the Spanish Civil War for a few reasons. There's not a whole lot of troops here to start off with, so more so than in probably any other conflict, since you're only lend-leasing one unit to Spain, or Republican Spain, I should say, per turn, then every single turn really matters and every unit really matters. Um, you have, as Republican Spain, you kind of have the luxury as well as the disadvantage of going second, so you kind of have to really gauge your play based on what the German player is going to do. As you said, Madrid is a huge, huge benefit because it is a city, it is ridiculously defensible, and it just allows you to attack any nearby province.
Which
So,
is essentially every province in Spain. If you control Madrid, you can literally attack any province in Spain.
really, what I look at when I'm looking at what I want to do with Spain is trying to counteract whatever Germany and Italy is doing, trying to counter their plays. I generally like to employ one of two strategies. The first strategy that I personally tend to employ is the kind of the attrition, where I will purchase infantry for the Republicans and just have them wear down and whittle down uh, the nationalists by attacking with the fighters and defending with the infantry. Um, I have not seen that to be a winning strategy, but I get a lot more bang for my buck, and I tend to dish out more than I take. Um, a second strategy that I like to employ is kind of the uh, attacking the naval bases. So, as you may notice, when this first starts out, the nationalists only have one port, one naval base, which they can lend lease into.
Right.
You have, uh, handily enough, a tactical bomber, which you start with. So, if you're able to tactical bomb the naval base, you're able to damage it and be able to force the Germans and the Italians to spend money to repair it, therefore making it even more of a money pit, money that they don't want to spend here. Um, Unfortunately, that is kind of like a high risk, high reward type of a play because they got these fighters here that can scramble against you.
Correct, and the inherent anti-aircraft guns as well. So that could turn messy pretty quick. I mean, the last thing you want to do is lose your air force as the Republicans kind of takes away all your attacking power really, and as Russia, who's sitting on what like seven or eight income per turn, um, 8 income per turn, it's much harder to be able to afford uh, really good units. Whereas Germany, who is what in the 20s and counting for their income, they have basically a much stronger bank account that they can use to send aid to the nationalists. It's very common from what I've seen to on the first turn or two as the Germans is to send some sort of aircraft, usually another fighter, maybe a tactical bomber, something like that. To give them more of a punch, while you use the Italians' weaker economy to send either infantry or mountain infantry, and sort of do like a 1-2 punch and kind of counter what the Republicans are buying you. If the Republicans buy infantry, then you buy infantry as Italy, which of course is on the map by the time it comes around to Nationalist Spain's turn again. So that does certainly, I think, give them an advantage. Obviously, their disadvantage being in that they basically have to move around Madrid to take anything. They need to protect their aircraft and where they can land, keep a port open, with the ultimate goal of taking Madrid at some point.
So when I play as the Republicans, and maybe this is just my particular play style, but I felt that I have always had the initiative. Um, Never, never, never underestimate the power of controlling Madrid. Um, because you control Madrid, you dictate the pace of the war and where it's going to strike. So, uh, having this initiative really sets the stage for if you, as the Soviet Union, want to go all in and buy really expensive units, it's definitely possible for you to win really quickly, really fast. Um, but in doing so, you're leaving yourself much more vulnerable at home.
Right, and that's the far-reaching effect is that I mean you're basically spending half of what the Russian income is on the Spanish Civil War, while the Germans, if you buy like for like, infantry for infantry, the Germans are more like spending 1/7 of their income on the Spanish Civil War. So it's kind of like, well, who can afford it more, really? The longer it goes on, the more it sort of bleeds Russia if they're intent on trying to win the Spanish Civil War. While it's not as big a burden on the Germans, though of course they are building up for some pretty major conflicts in Europe, while the Italians, and I heard a pretty interesting Italian strategy lately. Basically, as the Italians, you can stay neutral the entire war. I mean, as long as you don't attack another country, no one can declare war on you ever. So you could quite literally just lend lease all your money each turn to Spain, or once Germany's at war to Germany as well. But that's a discussion for another day. But
Yeah, that's
uh,
pretty sneaky.
yeah,
Um, so definitely when you're playing as the Republican Spanish, um, you control the flow because you control Madrid. You have the initiative. But the biggest thing that you always need to look out for is time is not on your side in the short term because generally you're only getting one lend lease while the nationalists get two lend lease. But also in the long term, the longer the war goes on, eventually when 1941, 1942 comes around, the Germany proper will be taken over France, and they'll be poised to just move in with their tanks and aircraft and just crush everybody. So you cannot wait and just sit there forever. You, as the Republican Spanish, it is on you to know when to decisively strike, because if you just sit there and wait, you will eventually lose.
exactly. There's the waiting game now. So the obviously the way the Spanish Civil War works is that only the 6 territories of homeland Spain count. So at the end of each Spanish turn, um, you roll a die, 12-sided die, and if you roll the number of territories you have or less, you get a free infantry or 2 militia that you can place anywhere, which really can make or break the Spanish Civil War. For the nationalists, it could, it's the difference of 2 new units or 3 or 4. Whereas for the Republicans, you can, essentially match on that particular turn what the nationalists are getting. Um, the other big factor with Spain, not only does it increase income for the winning side, I believe, uh, maybe it's just to Might just be to the Axis side. Yeah. So if the nationalists win, Germany and Italy get a +1 money bonus per turn, and it also meets the victory requirement. For the Russians, it just meets a victory point condition. But if the Civil War, well, before I get into what happens if the Civil War is unresolved, if one side is victorious, um, then that basically forms Spain, and it either leans towards the Axis or the communists. And then uh, once, if it goes to the Republican Spain, as soon as Germany and Russia are at war, Spain basically turns Russian. Their units are replaced by Russian units. Their income they collect goes to Russia, uh, which could open up an early second front on the Germans potentially. However, on the other side of things, if the nationalists win, it stays as a neutral country, unless it's attacked, of course. But it also only joins the Germans if the Germans have either conquered London or if they possess both Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. So it's a bit harder for the Germans to absorb or align the nationalists if they win the war. Um, but if the war should be ongoing by the time Germany declares a war on Russia, well, that's where things get interesting because then the Spanish align to their respective sides immediately. So the nationalists and their territories become German and or German units, and obviously Germany can move in, while the Spanish turn Russian, and the same thing. Their income and everything goes to the Russian player. Which brings up an interesting thing though, because the French, even though they're basically anti-fascist, anti-Germans, they actually want the Germans to win because if the uh, Russians win and the Axis are ultimately defeated, if there are Russian troops on the French border of its homeland, so northern Spain here, then they lose victory points over that. So they would much rather have a German victory and have a neutral Spain than a Republican victory and a communist Spain uh, for their victory conditions at the end of the game. Uh,
That is
and
definitely one of the intricacies when you have such a large and advanced game such as Global War 1936. And definitely once, if the Spanish Civil War does drag on to the point where Republican Spain aligns with the Soviet Union, that's basically a lost condition because they're not a separate nation. You can no longer lend lease to them anymore. So these units are essentially trapped. They are trapped
exactly.
until they are essentially destroyed. So
Or whoever controls the factory in Madrid, because then you could build Russian units in Madrid because there's a minor factory there.
yeah, that might be good to build one unit, but when you've got the whole German war machine knocking on your door, that's definitely not a position you want to be. So for the Republicans, you definitely want to end things before that happens.
Right, and for the British, it's the same sort of thing where normally you're basically preparing to defend against a naval invasion of Gibraltar, but if the Civil War is still going on, well, hello, you may all of a sudden have German units on your doorstep coming through the land, which negates your fortification and everything, which obviously puts Gibraltar under much greater threat of invasion. Um, so again, they may also be rooting for an early nationalist victory before all-out war breaks out between the Germans and Russians for those same conditions. Um,
So overall, I really like the way that even the vanilla Spanish Civil War goes. I really like how it is an introduction to how a lot of the mechanics work. It tells new players and veteran players the intricacies on how combat works and mountain terrains and drawing lines to roundels to see where territories go.
right.
Um,
I think it's also a good example of it's kind of like a warm up for the actual war, but it's a good example of the victory conditions of the game as opposed to being the sort of conquest, conquer all the cities, etc. This kind of shows you, hey, yes, you may be part of the Allies, but you may actually want the Germans to win this war and not the Russians, because if the Russians win, well, then you lose out on potential victory points. And at the end of the game, it could come down to who has those extra one or two victory conditions met for those points. Um, so it's it kind of also introduces new players at least to the this is not a game of global domination, but more intricate or tactical conquest sort of thing, where each country has some specific goals, and even though you may share some goals with other countries, you may have other goals that are sort of opposing each other. Um, and I think the Spanish Civil War is a very good example of some of those goals, where France may open up its rail system to the Germans and Italians to lend lease, into different territories, if if the nationalists have made it to their border, even though in a couple of years' time, France is probably going to be invaded by Germany. So it kind of puts some interesting gameplay out there, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. So, Spanish Civil War, it's really small. It's in a little part of the entire world, but its effects are definitely felt throughout the rest of the game. So it's never something to be overlooked. It's something that all players have to look at to understand what's going on. And it's just kind of one of those neat little things that I really appreciate, and I think it was very well executed. And I'm really looking forward to trying out the expansion.
Exactly. We'll certainly be taking a look at that. As some of you may have noticed, my viewers, I've greatly updated this mod, changed a lot of things around, made it a bit better visually, etc. Still a few little tweaks to fix here and there. Um, but if you have noticed, you may have noticed some oil derricks and some armored trains, which are some other expansions I've been looking into incorporating into the game. So, Rekoom, thank you for joining me once again. Later this week, I guess, since it technically is Monday, we'll be coming out with another video. I haven't quite worked out the details on that one yet. I'm going to have to sort of reassess and take a look at, see what needs to be covered before we start talking strategies for everyone. But Thanks for watching the video. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Leave some comments, ask some questions. I'll try and answer them. I'm not an expert. I'm certainly still learning stuff about this game. Um, this is Panzer Penguin signing out,
Goodbye.
and we'll catch you next time.